So at the end of my last video, which was a long, close read of Putin's justification of his invasion of Ukraine, I made a point about how leftists should be viewing the Russian government, which is not a left-wing government, with equal skepticism as they view the United States government. I don't want to talk too much before I show the videos that I'm sure you can already see on the screen, and I'm going to play them in a second, but I just want to say that I recommend that you watch that video if you haven't already, because it really kind of shows the extent to which the waters of this crisis are muddied by the Russian government, because it has gone from being about NATO to being about far-right groups in Ukraine and the sovereignty of, the East Ukraine separatists, and I will not be covering all of that here, and so I'm kind of operating on the knowledge that, or on the assumption that you've at least heard that speech or watched my read of it. So I want to listen to President Bush announce the invasion of Iraq, make a couple points about it, and then I'm going to listen to Vladimir Putin do the same. And I want to talk about the parallels that we see. So let's listen to Bush first.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force.
If you were to listen to that speech without knowledge of the outcome that we have seen happen in the 2 decades following, you would think that America is a benevolent actor looking to protect the world's innocent people from the use of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of a dictator. It would appear, given the information the U.S. government had allowed you to see in this address, that military involvement was not only justified, but the only option to stop a force of evil from taking hold. Right? And nobody who makes those claims today is taken seriously. Nobody who says today that our involvement in Iraq was fully justified is viewed as a serious political actor, because we have seen hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians die largely because of this intervention. So the harm, and also the WMDs were a lie, right? So there was the original justification was that there were WMDs. That's what Colin Powell said in front of the United Nations. And our stated purpose was to protect innocent people. Turns out, no WMDs, and a lot of innocent people died because of our intervention. So with our knowledge after the fact, we're able to look at this government statement and say, wow, that really sucked. But at the time, if you didn't already look at this with a degree of serious skepticism, you probably wouldn't have been able to back up the argument, which turned out to be the right one, that no, we shouldn't do this in the way that Bush is suggesting. We shouldn't intervene with force. And we shouldn't wage, depending on who you ask, an 8-year or to some extent, 20-year war in Iraq. So nobody is going to view the words that Bush uses here as, something that's accurately representing the situation. So now let's listen to a clip from the Vladimir Putin speech on February 24th.
Народные республики Донбасса обратились к России с просьбой о помощи. Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины, а также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе и граждан Российской Федерации.
Okay, that also sounds justified. Because Putin is framing this mission, this special military operation, as not an invasion, but a special military operation, not against the people of Ukraine, but against neo-Nazis, against the people who have bullied the sovereign people of Donetsk and Luhansk, right? So this framing is without prior knowledge of the Russian government's motives and actions, something that is justified, and something that is convincing. And it's for this reason that the anti-imperialist left, when listening to a statement by an imperialist government, or if you like, even a, power-seeking geopolitical player, you have to view it with a degree of skepticism, because at very few points in modern history has a government said, yes, we want conquest. You know what I mean? Like, we want to go into this place and sack it and make it ours, annex it, occupy it, right? Very few times has that been done, or not done, but, advocated for in that way, because that is something that is hard to convince a population to fight for these days. Even in the Nazi regime, the invasion of Czechoslovakia in early 1939 was framed as a way of protecting the German minority there. The invasion of France was framed as a way of removing the backstabbing Jewish bankers from control of Western Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union was viewed as a protection of Western Europe from some kind of Jewish communist menace. So even a government as barbaric and, decided on conquest as the Nazi regime didn't justify its actions to its people honestly. It didn't honestly say, we want to conquer. At the very least, this wasn't its only way of justifying it. We want to conquer this territory. You know what I mean? And so when looking at the states of the modern day, most of which are not, neo-Nazis, the way that they have to justify war to maintain stability is framing it in a defensive way. You would be hard-pressed to find an exception to that rule. I mean, I'm sure there's one out there somewhere, but I don't know at what point it would be beneficial to a government who wants to engage in conquest to frame it as honestly. And so I want to talk briefly in this video about why I think we as the left, we as the anti-imperialist left, have to be as skeptical of the Russian state media and their framing of this as we are, if not more, than we are about the United States, its United States counterpart. So when we see, op-eds in Politico saying, actually we should go to war with I don't remember the country, but it was going around Twitter. It was like presented by Lockheed Martin, right? So like there are multiple times when U.S. newspapers will say like, no, we should go do this war. Like John Bolton wrote for, I think it was the Washington Post, like to stop Iran from getting a bomb Iran, right? And there's a vested interest in platforming these people for the U.S. Government, because that's what we want to do. A lot of the time, we want to engage in military action to bring economic benefit and geopolitical benefit to our empire. And the left almost always sees through that. So every time since the Iraq War, and also in the Iraq War, the left has viewed these proclamations as bullshit. The left was, in many instances, critical of President Obama for expanding the war on terror, for drone striking, even though he packaged it, if he packaged it at all, he would package it in a very charismatic, well-spoken, seemingly well-thought-out defensive measure to protect the people of, for example, Libya. But as I mentioned in my last video, I don't agree with that. The U.S. government is bad, and I can see that, and most people can see that, because of the prior knowledge that we have and the resulting skepticism that we have of our government. However, there is no reason to assume benevolence in the case of Russia. Russia is not a socialist government. It does not have an ideology grounded in anti-imperialism, such as socialism. And so when they, as a geopolitical actor, say that they want to invade a country, particularly one that has in the past been subjugated by a Russian empire, then you shouldn't take it at their word that they're doing so to protect the people of Ukraine. If this were really about the far-right fighters in the Donbass, then Putin would have invaded only eastern Ukraine. And this would be a similar conversation. I said in my last video I wouldn't be for that either, but we wouldn't be viewing this as like a unilateral annexation. It's much worse what he's doing now than what he could have done, which was send troops into the Donbass. And so it's clear, even now, when the dust has not settled, in fact, it's still being kicked up, it's clear that the motives of Russia's actions stretch well beyond the protection of the Russian, the ethnically Russian areas of eastern Ukraine, because he is attacking Kiev. He is attacking Chernobyl. He is, like, there's street fighting in Kiev as we speak. And so I just want to say to any person in my small audience that has been on the fence about this, that has wondered, well, maybe Putin is telling the truth. I want you to look even at his own words in the speech, before the speech that I covered in my last video, where he talked about how it was a mistake on the part of the Soviets to give Ukraine a degree of sovereignty. And he alluded to a sort of blood and soil rhetoric about how the Ukrainians and the Russians are one. Which essentially is, in all but name, advocating for a restoration of the Tsarist Empire that dominated the 19th, century in the region. So I was disappointed during the lead up to this conflict when so many Marxist-Leninists, the guy who wrote like the book on the Marxist analysis of imperialism, they were taking Russia at their word. There were people on Twitter saying stuff like, dude, Russia said they don't want to invade. Why are we even talking about this? They already said they don't want to invade. And then the day that they invaded, I'm like basically quoting verbatim. It was like, well, shit. They were all surprised. like a lot of them aren't trying to defend it now. I don't think like most of the Marxist-Leninists aren't really trying to defend the invasion. But like this was very clear from the get-go. But because it was the State Department who was saying that they had intelligence on this type of thing, and because it was the West and NATO who were sounding the alarms about the potential invasion of Ukraine, we shooed it away. We didn't care because it is a source that we don't like. Well, you shouldn't like Russia either. And while it's true that we should view these things with a degree of skepticism, and while it's appropriate not to take, at the time, the West's word at face value regarding the build up on Ukraine's border, it became pretty quickly clear, especially with Russia's recognition of the independence of the Eastern republics, what Russia was doing here. And time after time after time, the predictions that were being made by the Western intelligence apparatus were proven to be true in this instance. I understand that we should be skeptical of them as well. I'm not saying we should place our faith in them, en masse, okay? But the reality is that we should view Russia as the actor that it is. And so when in the future a Western intelligence agency says, hey, Russia might do this again, we shouldn't take them at face value, but we shouldn't throw that claim to the wayside either, because it is very plausible that Russia does this again. And it's very plausible that Russia continues to imperialize that region. I mean, say that there's a movement in Belarus to put in a pro-Western government, right? Whether or not the West is involved. And say it's installed. And then a few years down the line, we say, wow, this is weird. Russia's building up forces on the Belarusian border. What's going on? I would be very disappointed if my fellow leftists ignored that possibility in the same way that they did here. So, in short, what I'm trying to say, last point I'll make, be diligent. Don't listen to other imperialists just because they aren't the U.S. State Department. Thank you all for listening. I went way longer than I wanted to. I will see you guys in whatever I do next. Bye.